Good morning, Christ City. It's great to be out here with you. So the Fungs, Justin and Caroline, took in my daughter last year when she was interning for Telos. And so there's nothing that makes a parent feel better or happier or more appreciative than when people take in and care for your family. And so also the church welcomed her in. So she then moved back to D.C., and has been here for almost a year, and this is her church, so it's kind of fun to be with you. I was told strict instructions, no stories of my daughter, and so instead we're going to go a very history-focused route. So if you're a history lover, this sermon's for you. If you're like me and you can't sit longer than 60 seconds in a chair, I would welcome you to stand up to the sides or the back and listen that way. Perfectly okay. Sound good? Okay. Isaiah 58, Matthew 25. Most people don't know Jesus is actually quoting Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 is this great passage where God is speaking and saying, you have it completely wrong. Your aspirations, your desires of connecting with me are disconnected from your fellow man. And if you want to connect with me, it actually is going to come through your engagement with the other. Does that make sense? So both of these passages are spoken to the religious leaders as a rebuke of how they understand coming to God. Let me just say it this way, that our discussion of community, which is the topic this morning, is nothing short of a discussion of knowing God. If you came in this morning and you want to know God, it's tied to our discussion of community. Another way of saying it is that God isn't here to co-sign our individual aspirations, but to challenge and inform our values of living in community. Make sense? So individualism is a barrier or the barrier to community, and we're going to kind of focus on the barrier to try and get us to an understanding of community this morning. We were at the Native American History Museum yesterday, and there was a picture that I found really powerful, and it was a picture really with this idea, native idea of one bowl, many spoons. I don't know if they're showing or not, okay? One bowl, many spoons, really saying that we might all be different, but we're all together. And this particular piece, and as it was brought forward to the United States representatives, was a rebuke to them that you keep dealing with us as individual tribes, trying to divide us, but we actually come from a viewpoint that there should be one bowl, many spoons. We could sit with that for quite a while, right? One bowl, many spoons. But what it really points out is how the United States was operating, and we were operating according to our chief philosophical conviction, which is called historically or philosophically American individualism. If you want to understand the culture of America, it's individualism. In fact, we always have had individualism, but it was tempered a lot more in the early days of the United States. And the historian, my favorite historian, Andrew Del Banco, kind of articulates this, but he takes great pains to show that although we were individualists early on in the United States, we all were submitted to this idea of God. So even a Thomas Jefferson, who was more of a deist or a theist, still had this idea of a creator, even if it wasn't kind of the Christian God all the way, that everybody kind of had something they submitted to in reference to God. And that goes until after the Civil War. You get into this period where now you've had Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, which came out in 1859, right before our Civil War. But after the Civil War, it really hit the intellectual kind of circuit of the United States. You had in Boston the great transcendentalists, Henry David Thoreau, who I love, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, his famous essay on self-reliance. And so you saw this move away from this idea of a creator God to this idea of really what we're anchoring into is going to be something else. And so we needed to replace God, and what we replaced it with was nationalism. This idea that we're going to unite as individuals, not under God, but under this idea of the United States and this flag. And so that's when you see Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century come around. 1903, no, 1898. Anyways, right in that period, the Spanish-American War. And so we all of a sudden get into empire. We take over Puerto Rico for a period of time. We take over Cuba. We take the Philippines in the name of liberating these people from the Spanish colonial imperial rule. Do you see the irony there? We didn't really free them. We just took someone else's colonial possessions in the name of freedom, but then retained them. There's a lot of tangents I want to go on. I won't. Justin gave me strict time constraints. So you had this interesting thing where the flag, where nationalism comes along, and that obviously is magnified greatly, or a lot of gas poured on that fire with World War I and then World War II. And then this period of the 1950s where the economy globally was in shambles, and then therefore meant that our economy really boosted. So you have this idea of the greatness of the United States. Even in the Cold War against the USSR, we are kind of the religious grouping. The USSR is this atheistic entity, socialist entity. And so you see even this kind of pride come along. By the way, in God We Trust on the dollar bill, I grew up thinking that the founding fathers put that on the dollar bill. Do you want to know when that hit the dollar bill? It's in the 50s under Eisenhower. It was a resurgence of religion in the face of the Cold War and after World War II. We were the great Christian liberator of the world. And then we hit the Vietnam War. And so Andrew Delbanco says we've gone from submission to God to kind of this nationalism, Christian nationalism, if you will. And then we hit the Vietnam War, which breaks everyone's categories. Now we're getting into this murky, messy, foggy business where it looks a lot more like we're an oppressor. Or certainly our righteous cause doesn't feel so righteous. And we move away from this idea of wanting to be associated with that to beginning to go, we need something else. And that's when we took a turn to the self. And so Delbanco says we went from God to nation to self. And then from the 70s on, it's like I can't trust anything outside of myself to anchor into, so I'm going to anchor into myself. And that's when we get to the final stage of what is now America's form of individualism. And the real dangerous thing there is, yes, we were leaving complicated things, but we went from something outside of ourselves, to nothing outside of ourselves. Does that make sense? And so the form of individualism that we have had since then in our culture is really a casting around to say, I'm radically committed to self, but I can't find anything to anchor myself external to me. And there's a lot of manifestations of that disease. The worst forms are school shootings, everything else, the mental health issues that come with not being grounded. But that's really the arc that Andrew Delbanco kind of argues that we have. That is tied, again, to the beginnings of our form of individualism that was born in the Declaration of Independence. History of human rights really begins in the Enlightenment period and fighting against kings. So the 1700s is really when we get human rights language. Before that, you didn't have the phrase human rights. You might have said natural rights, but you wouldn't have been talking about human rights. And the interesting thing about human rights, if we get in and started studying it, is that human rights necessitate human responsibilities, right? If I have a right that I can claim against you, then you have a responsibility toward me. And if you have a right you can claim against me, I have a responsibility towards you. It's a give and a take. It's two sides of a coin, right? You can't have human rights sans or without human responsibilities. Which side of that coin do we only talk about in the United States? The other extreme would be socialism. Which side of the coin do they mostly talk about? They're both wrong. You have to have those things married together. Does that make sense? But our overemphasis on human rights was why it was so fascinating for me to watch during COVID, the debates about vaccines and masks. When somebody was so adamant that they would, stories of people getting off planes because someone was wearing a mask next to them. Like they're so committed to this individualistic thing that they're offended that somebody, you know what I mean? Like there's something really sick going on there. And the vaccines wasn't about this right that I get to choose what I'm doing with my body. It's saying in this scenario, what you do as a germ carrier ultimately is going to affect other people. And so you don't get to just think of yourself as an individual. You have to think corporate. And so other countries, my best friends in Hong Kong, one of my best friends is in Hong Kong, totally different approach. Australia, totally different approach to vaccines. The UK, totally different approach to vaccines, believe it or not, than the United States. We were alone in this one thing. By the way, I saw a picture yesterday in the Word Museum of somebody with a dodgeball, a kid with a dodgeball, and a kid with a machine gun, and the caption said, "One of these two things has been banned because it's too violent." You know what? I didn't know, but I grew up on dodgeball. I didn't know it had gotten banned when I wasn't paying attention. But, you know, our rights dominate our thinking. Property rights, and we're talking about breaking treaties with Native Americans. Property rights are what define us because we're so committed to kind of individualism. In Australia, another one of my good friends is in Australia, they have what they call the tall poppy syndrome. If you try to elevate yourself above the collective, above others, because you think you're so great, you're so narcissistic that you would do that, it's called the tall poppy syndrome. And the idea is that, like a weed whacker, that should be cut off. There's something dysfunctional about you to try and elevate above others. Tall poppy syndrome. People often, when I'm traveling, will ask me, what is the culture of America? The United States, by the way. And I'll say hot dogs, hamburgers, and football on Sundays. We don't really have defining culture here. So again, we're casting around, trying to latch on. This is an aside, but I watched a fantastic PBS documentary a couple months ago on the American buffalo. Highly recommend it if you're a documentary freak like me. And what stood out was towards the end of the documentary, after they'd kind of gone through all the iterations, Wild Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill, in his Wild West show, one of his enemies and the guy that ultimately defeated General Custer, Sitting Bull, came to be one of these, what they called show Indians. That would portray Native Americans in these kind of settings. And Sitting Bull actually spent 4 months as a part of Buffalo Bill Cody's kind of Wild West show when it was in New York State. And there was this kind of part where they go into Sitting Bull, and Sitting Bull went to New York City and walked around, and he couldn't believe how many destitute white people there were, and that nobody was caring for them. Like it broke his brain to see what was going on. He didn't understand the culture. And eventually he's like, I can't do this. He goes back to the reservation and within 2 months had distributed all of his earnings to the community. And that one little part of this grand narrative of the buffalo just stood out to me. And I have so much decolonizing to do in my own heart that I will never fully get there in my lifetime. Just an aside. By the way, we could go into reparations, talk there, but we won't. Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. If we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. So where's Christianity in the story of individualism? Unfortunately, it's tied to it in an unholy marriage. It's tied to it in unholy marriage. I've long talked about the story of Barbados. I got to go there about 5 weeks ago. Been a lifelong quest of mine. This is the historical museum in Barbados. Not a big museum, not a rich museum. The first exhibit you see is an umbrella signed by Rihanna because she's from Barbados. Under my umbrella, Ella, 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 you know. There you go. But there's something fascinating here because obviously this is one of the biggest sugar territories in the British Empire. And so slaves coming in, sugar going out, and this was the economy eventually because they learned how to make something out of the waste product of that sugar, which is called molasses. They learned how to make rum from molasses. So then you had slaves coming in, rum going to the United States, to the 13 colonies, and sugar going back to Great Britain and Europe. But one of the richest plantations in all of the Caribbean was gifted to the British Foreign Mission Society in 1710. The Codrington Plantation was gifted to the Foreign Mission Society, which was the official name, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. John Wesley was actually a missionary in the 1730s to the Native Americans in Georgia as a missionary with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to foreign parts. They took possession of this richest of all sugar plantations and owned it till 1843. I always used to tell my classes, never trust a date of mine. They're close, but you can Google and get the exact. I think it's 1843 when slavery was officially ended. So 1710 to 1843, they owned this plantation until by law, they couldn't keep making money off it. That means they were complicit in slaves being trafficked to Barbados, in the purchasing of slaves, in the running of slaves for over 100 years. That's the gospel. That's how twisted we can make things when we think we're serving the gospel. This next slide was why I'd always wanted to get there. These are artifacts from slavery, but the top right is, I think it's the Christopher Codrington brand, but this Codrington plantation, when it was taken over by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the slave runners would brand slaves, but then when they got to the plantation, they would be rebranded, and there was actually a brand that said society that they would use on the chest of the slaves at this place. And for a long time, that has been the searing image of literally the gospel as a brand on individuals, and how twisted Christianity can be when we lose sight of the other and our aspirations or colonial visions or whatever it might be end up running away with individual or segmented kind of values and ideas. Does that make sense? When we really rupture and disconnect, this is what can happen. I'll move on just a little bit. Interesting, we're in D.C., so I'll share some of my D.C. bits. But Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. Columbia is the feminine Latin for Columbus. Our founding fathers wanted to take Columbus as what they were going to roll with, because Plymouth was the British, right? Columbus never set foot in the United States. His 4 journeys were all to the Caribbean and South America, just off the coast of South America. But we named our capital after Columbus, Columbia. The capital of South Carolina, Columbia University, was originally King's College, renamed Columbia after Columbus, who's this kind of paragon of of colonialism and everything that happened. He was the first domino, if you will, in all of that craziness and exploitation. A little bit further. So Colombia is basically the Latin version that we took, just like Britannia or Germania. Like this was, every country kind of had a feminine kind of picture. So they actually had a idealized version of what the feminine U.S. would be, and she was called Miss Columbia. By the way, we had this, again, we wanted to separate from the British Empire, so we went back and cast around, and we took on a lot of the Roman Empire. Great example, right, in history. But why is all the architecture neoclassical? With Doric and Ionic and Corinthian columns all over this city. Why did we take the British system of government with a House of Commons and then an upper house, which they call the House of Lords? We called our upper house the what? What was the Senate from? That's the Roman Senate, which basically means wise men, back then. We took the eagle, which was the standard on the top of flags and everything of the Roman Empire. So if we had an American flag here, there'd be a little eagle on top of it. We took it as our national bird. Heraldic is what they call it, symbol, is the eagle. That's how we got that, which is such an offense to the Native Americans in the United States at that time, because it was such a spiritual symbol for their communities. So even this just dissonance that comes in there. G.K. Chesterton once said, with an oblique reference to the United States, the eagle has no liberty, he only has loneliness. The eagle has no liberty, speaking of us, he has only loneliness. If we buy individualism, we shouldn't be surprised when we feel disconnected. It's logical, isn't it? There's a picture here of Columbia. Did we see the Columbia picture? So this is Miss Columbia. By the way, the first renditions of her were much more Native American and then obviously Anglicized over time. This is the World War I representation. After World War I, we begin to switch to thinking of the Statue of Liberty as the feminine picture of the United States. Prior to that, it's Miss Columbia, not to be confused with the pageants. And this was an Armenian woman, so think Kim Kardashian. But this was, they shall not perish. These people in the Middle East and Armenia that the Ottoman Empire is killing in such great numbers, we're standing in the way of this massacre. Do you see the gross hypocrisy with our history? Why do we always cast ourselves as the hero? The hero is the singular individual, is it not? The hero is the tall poppy. When the culture is about tall poppy, our projection is going to be the hero, even though we're blind to all of what that means, and the twisted irony. Even crazier, and I never realized this for a long time in teaching justice-related stuff, but the next picture is a famous picture from 1872 by a Prussian who was living in New York. But this is the famous picture of Manifest Destiny. The name of the portrait is called American Progress. Do you know who's in the middle? Columbia, Miss Columbia. And she's got a star on her forehead and her hair that represents empire, says the painter. On the left, Native Americans being pushed along with the buffalo out. She has in her hand a wire for the telegraph line and a book meaning education, because Native Americans, by and large, were illiterate in our forms. And you see darkness on the left and light on the right. And so here's this Christianizing, promised land taking idea of what's happening. And there's the feminine of Columbus. So it shouldn't surprise us that we're acting in the spirit of Columbus when we've taken all of the language, symbolism, and values of Columbus in a Christianized way. I once was at a conference. I had a secular speaker from Berkeley, very famous historian by the name of Adam Hochschild. He wrote a book on slavery called Bury the Chains. He gave his whole talk, and then he took Q&A at the end, and there was this very well-connected, tall poppy Christian in the back that immediately jumped on him and said, first question out of the gate, why did you take away the glory of abolition from the Christians? You took us, you separate us from that story because you gave the credit to abolition to empathy. At the end of his book, he says, empathy is what changed everything. And he says, you took away like this Christian wonderful story of how we were the heroes, basically. And I was like really embarrassed. I was like, oh no, like, I like Adam Hochschild. I wanted to be his friend. Like, why did there have to be a Christian like that in the crowd? And Adam Hochschild didn't miss a beat, and he looked so confused. And he stared out at everyone, and he said, who do you think they ended slavery from? The Portuguese began it. They were Catholic Christians. The Dutch carried it forward. They were Calvinists that thought God ordained that there should be certain people on the bottom. And then the British weaponized slavery to a whole different level. Like, they were all Christians and Christian governments and societies for the propagation of the gospel. Like, who do you think why am I going to give 10 Christians credit for ending Christian slavery? So how has Christianity come into this story of weird individualism kind of wrapped in colonialism and everything else? We're in an unholy marriage with it. I won't get into politics, but maybe you'll make some connections to current day politics. Maybe. When Christianity is a tool or aim of colonialism, it will kill and destroy whatever is in its path. The other is something to be overcome or subjugated. Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. We're not here to co-sign our colonial aspirations, but to challenge and inform them with our values. So I'll just try and wrap up pretty quickly. I think in God's family, there's not supposed to be any spiritual orphans. You saw the dedication of the babies. God's intention is for us to be together. When we're separate or alone or individual, that's when things are broken. Does that make sense? The aim or the purpose is community, to be together. We're supposed to have a right relationship with God, self, others, and creation. By the way, that's the theological definition of justice. A right relationship with God, others, self, and creation. There's a quote I put up here from Stanley Hauerwas. Remember, we're supposed to be sojourners or aliens in this world. And it says this, to be resident but alien is a formula for loneliness that few of us can sustain. Indeed, it is almost impossible to minister alone because our loneliness can too quickly turn us into turn into self-righteousness or self-hate. We can't function as Christians alone. We necessarily require others in order to be our true selves. The gravity of a planet, the density of a planet or even of an atom is what allows things to be in gravitational pull, whether it's planets or satellites around a planet, or whether it's electrons, I think, around a neutron. I'm not a big science guy. But it's the density of a thing. That's my picture of church. Like, what would happen in this city if Christ City was so tight that it sucked in things in a just manner around it? And if it's not tight, its capacity lessens. Does that make sense? The density is what's going to give it to us. So whether this is your first time here, whether you're only living in D.C. for a year, you need this to be fully human. We think of community when we're individualists. We think of community as, what am I going to get out of that? Well, I'm only going to live in D.C. for a year. What's the point? We have to be into community because otherwise it's the status quo. Status quo is Latin for the mess we're in. I'm making that up. Last comment on community. A friend of mine used to always say this, it isn't true community until there's someone there who you wish wasn't. It isn't true community until there's someone who's there who you wish wasn't. In Hebrews it says this, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful, and therefore let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some Americans are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Amen? Amen.